Once bones are formed, they undergo a constant process of remodeling. And remodeling is the product of the activity of both osteoclasts, which break down bone, and osteoblasts, which deposit bone. And this process of constantly breaking down bone and building up bone keeps bone mass constant. About 5 to 10% of your bones are remodeled per year, so that means every 10 to 20 years you get a whole new skeleton. Now, one of the triggers for bone homeostasis, or more accurately, the increase in activity of osteoclasts, is, let's say your blood calcium concentration falls. The biggest source of calcium in your body is your bones. So what'll happen is the blood calcium will signal the parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone will then go to the bones, activate osteoclasts down here. Osteoclasts will resorb bone, break it down, releasing calcium into the bloodstream. That is going to increase your blood calcium levels. And once your blood calcium levels are increased, that'll shut off parathyroid hormone, which will then shut off the activity of osteoclasts. Now, if blood calcium levels are too high, that will go to the thyroid glands and the C cells that'll release calcitonin. Calcitonin will go and activate osteoblasts, which will take calcium from the blood, deposit it into bone, and those osteoblasts will lay down new bone as a result. When blood calcium has decreased, that will go back to the thyroid gland, shut off the release of calcitonin, which will then shut down the activity of osteoblasts. So this is a mechanism by which the osteoclast and osteoblast activity is regulated by the amount of calcium that is circulating in the blood. Now, another function of bone, besides the obvious of protection, is to serve as a repository of inorganic salts. Because salts account for about 70% of the bone matrix. As you learned from the crash course, most of your bone is collagen that's deposited, which forms the framework of your bones, and then all of those inorganic salts are laid down to make the bone hard and act as a protective layer. So most of those salts are calcium phosphate. So your bones are a very good source of both calcium and phosphate. And those two together, those crystals are called hydroxyapatite. As shown in the previous slide, the parathyroid hormone will stimulate osteoclasts to resorb bone when calcium levels are low. Calcitonin will activate osteoblasts to build bone when calcium levels are high. But your bone also contains significant concentrations of magnesium, sodium, potassium, and carbonate. And there are going to be different mechanisms by which these are deposited into bone and released from bone under certain circumstances, but we're not going to go into those details here. So when we talk about the homeostasis of both calcium and phosphorus in the form of phosphate, we have to talk about bone. So that's why it's usually included in the topic of bones. So calcium, the recommended daily allowance for that is about 1,000 milligrams. And for phosphorus as phosphate, again, the recommended daily allowance is about 700 milligrams. Calcium homeostasis, as we've discussed, is regulated by the parathyroid glands with PTH, or parathyroid hormone, and by the thyroid glands with calcitonin. All right, and again, parathyroid gland, we talked about the effects that it has on the bone, increasing bone resorption by increasing osteoclast activity, but it also increases calcium absorption in the small intestine and also increases calcium reabsorption by the kidneys, as well as the formation of vitamin D to help with the absorption of calcium in the small intestine. Calcitonin, on the other hand, just the opposite of what happens with parathyroid hormone. In bone, it decreases bone resorption or increases bone building, which decreases the amount of calcium in the blood. In the small intestine, it decreases the amount of calcium that is absorbed and thus gets put out in excrement as waste. And it also decreases the amount of calcium that's reabsorbed in the kidneys so that goes out with urine output. Phosphorus concentration in the form of phosphate is regulated as a byproduct of calcium homeostasis. And while most phosphate in the body exists in the skeleton, you can find that phosphate exists elsewhere in the body in various forms. And we'll just leave it at that. Now, we mentioned before that parathyroid hormone causes an increase in absorption of calcium from the digestive tract, and it does that through vitamin D activation. So the way this works is we get cholesterol from foods. I'm not sure why a carrot is there because you don't get cholesterol from carrots. And that cholesterol goes into intestinal enzymes, gets converted into a form of vitamin D. In the skin, that vitamin D gets converted into active vitamin D, or cholecalciferol, and then goes to the liver, goes to another form, hydroxycholecalciferol, goes to the kidneys to form dihydrocholecalciferol, which is the active form of vitamin D, and that which is stimulated by parathyroid hormone. And that goes into the small intestine, and with the calcium that's there from your diet, helps in the absorption of calcium into the digestive tract, into your blood, thus raising blood calcium. So briefly, what are the parathyroid glands and what is parathyroid hormone? Well, if we look at the thyroid gland here, the back of the thyroid gland, there are 4 small areas where the parathyroid glands are located. And their job is to secrete parathyroid hormone. And we already talked about the function of parathyroid hormone in previous slides. Again, more on the function of parathyroid hormone, which we've already covered. If parathyroid hormone is not working properly, in other words, if we have too much, as in hyperparathyroidism, or too little, hypoparathyroidism, with hyperparathyroidism, we have excess PTH. Therefore, we have excess bone. There's a typo here. Bone resorption. And with excess bone resorption, we're going to have an increase in blood calcium, leading to decreased bone density, which then leads to an increase in fractures, and also a decreased nervous system responsiveness, because if our calcium is too high, then the resting membrane potential is going to be too negative and harder to get nerve cells to respond quickly. In the case of hypoparathyroidism, where we don't have enough parathyroid hormone, we're not resorbing enough bone. Therefore, blood calcium is going to tend to be low. The main effect from that, hyperexcitable nervous system membranes. So if too much calcium brings the resting membrane potential to more negative, less calcium brings the resting membrane potential to more positive, or closer to the threshold for action potential, and so the nervous system is going to be more hyperexcitable, resulting in things like twitching, cramping, muscle spasms, and even paralysis as a result of tired out muscles. Calcitonin, secreted from the thyroid gland. We've already talked about the function of that and its role in calcium homeostasis in previous slides, so I'm not going to cover in any more detail about that. Now, as far as bone development in children that are still growing, vitamin D is absolutely necessary so that we get enough calcium to deposit into bone so they become nice and hard and protective. If we don't have enough vitamin D, then we're not going to have enough calcium in our body, and that could lead to conditions such as rickets or osteomalacia, where we don't have proper development of bones and they become soft, leading to malformations. Vitamin A is necessary for osteoblast and osteoclast activity, so that bone remodeling. If we have vitamin A deficiencies, that can retard bone development because we don't have the proper remodeling going on. And vitamin C is also necessary for collagen synthesis. Remember, collagen is what is laid down as the bone matrix, the organic part of bone that the hydroxyapatite is laid on top of, which makes it hard. So if we don't have vitamin C deficiency, it's like not having the structural framework underneath the concrete of a bridge, and that's going to result in a fragile bridge or fragile bones that will break very easily. Now a little bit about developmental differences in bone and the difference between male and female skeletons. If we look at the infant skull, we're going to notice that it's a lot different than the adult skull. You don't see well-deformed suture lines because those sutures have not quite formed yet, and there are going to be giant gaps in between certain areas of the bone, which are referred to as fontanelles. And the reason why we have these gaps, and this is connective tissue between the bones of the skull, is so that the cranial cavity can compress during the birthing process. And then after that process is complete, as the baby is developing over years, these fontanelles end up closing. These suture lines end up forming mature suture lines, like a mature wound that's healed by primary intention. And then those suture lines will grow and change with the skull as the skull develops throughout childhood and into adulthood. Now, if we look at the difference between male and female skeletons, there are very notable differences in the pelvis. Notice that female iliac bones are wide and more flared than male iliac bones. The pubic arch of the female tends to be broader, or the angle more obtuse. The curvature of the sacrum in the female is shorter and flatter than you see in the male. The male will tend to go more like this, whereas the female will be shorter and flatter. And again, that's to accommodate the birth canal. And all of these differences put together create a much wider pelvic cavity than what you would see for a male. And again, those differences are related to the reproductive functions of the female as opposed to the male, which doesn't have the same reproductive functions, i.e. birthing a baby. You also see differences between the male and female skulls. With males, you'll see more of a square chin, whereas the female chin will be more pointy. Males will have a more prominent ridge in their brow, whereas females will have a more flat brow. And you'll even see that the mastoid process of a male tends to be more pointy than the mastoid process of the female, and that would be due to a difference in the mass of muscle that's attached to it. And there are a few other differences that you can pick out in this particular slide, but be aware that there are, if you look at a male versus a female skeleton, you can tell the difference between the two. Does that mean that you're going to find female skeletons that look more like male skeletons? Of course. Are you going to find male skeletons that look more like female skeletons? Of course, it's a continuum. But in general, these are the primary differences that have been spotted in male versus female skeletons, which again will give rise to the various facial feature differences you see in males and females when you have skin on them. And finally, as far as lifespan changes go in the skeleton, usually there's a decrease in height that begins about age 30 because by the time you reach age 30, activity of osteoblasts takes a great downturn. Therefore, you're not building as much bone, and bones are more subject to wear and tear. So if those bones, especially in the vertebral column, tend to get shorter, then your overall height's going to get shorter. Calcium levels tend to fall because calcium homeostasis is not as well regulated as it is when you're younger. Bones become more brittle and more prone to fracture, again because you're not building as much bone. And the amount of physical activity that increases bone mass before age 30 does not have the same effect on bone mass after age 30. So bones will naturally get brittle and more prone to fracture regardless of how much activity you do. Osteoclasts will start to outnumber osteoblasts. That's also going to contribute to bones becoming more brittle and prone to fracture. Spongy bone, or that trabecular bone, weakens before compact bone, and that kind of makes sense because compact bone is much more solid and it takes longer to wear that away than it does the more thin trabecular bone. Bone loss, more rapid in postmenopausal women, and of course that has to do with the decrease in female hormone levels. Hip fractures are very common because that's where a lot of weight is born. And vertebral compression fractures are also common because the spine also carries a lot of weight.